On Thanksgiving, my daughter whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "He's just the handyman, not really part of this." The room froze, but no one defended me. They smiled politely, passed the plates, and let the words settle like dust. My hands, still raw from fixing the leaky pipes in her house that very morning, curled into fists under the table. I didn't speak. I never did. For them, I was always the man with the toolbox, the one who kept things running while everyone else carried titles, diplomas, and respect. The truth was simpler and crueler. I had built the very home they gathered in, plank by plank, nail by nail, long before they had children, long before their businesses took off, long before their names meant anything outside our small town. But none of that mattered now. They had convinced themselves I was just useful, a pair of hands they could summon when a hinge squeaked or a fuse blew. And so I sat there, invisible, swallowing their dismissal with my food, like I had done for years. Neighbors saw me the same way. "Oh, he's handy," they'd say, nodding with half smiles, never asking how I knew to repair a roof in the dead of winter or rewire a kitchen without shutting the whole block's power. They didn't wonder why I never charged much, or why I stayed longer than the job required, making sure things worked safely. They didn't want to know, and I never told them. What none of them realized, what I kept hidden in silence, was that my hands had not always held hammers and wrenches. Once, they had held the broken lives of strangers. Once, they had lifted people from places darker than any basement or attic. My story was buried under layers of rust, nails, and sawdust. I let them believe I was just the man who fixes things. It was easier, it was safer. But that night, at that table, with my daughter's words burning in my chest, something cracked. Not in the pipes, not in the walls, not in the floorboards, but in me. Because silence can patch 1,000 leaks, but it cannot hold back a flood forever. And though they didn't know it yet, though they laughed and poured their wine, a storm was already on its way. The kind of storm that doesn't break houses, but hearts. The kind of storm that would remind them who I really was. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with others. This is how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to light. And now, we continue. They didn't even bother to hide it anymore. The laughter came quick, sharp, cutting deeper than any blade. It was during those small moments, over dinner, at family gatherings, and casual conversation, that the truth of how they saw me always came out. I was not a father, not a man with a life worth remembering, not even someone whose sacrifices deserved respect. I was only the one who could fix their dripping sink, hang their shelves straight, replace the bulbs they couldn't reach. Nothing more. When they spoke of their successes, they did it with voices raised proudly, as though each word had been dipped in gold. Promotions, businesses, vacations in places I had never even seen on a map. Everything about their lives was worth showing off. But when their eyes fell on me, all that remained was the mockery. They would smile in that way people smile when they want you to feel smaller. "We can manage without you. It's not that complicated. Anyone can hammer a nail." Their words wrapped around me like chains. I wanted to believe it didn't matter. I told myself I was strong enough to take it. My hands had carried more weight than most men could imagine. Timber, stone, metal, even the weight of another man's sorrow once. These hands were not fragile. They had built homes, repaired what was broken, given warmth in cold nights. But the heart behind them, it was growing tired. Because a man can endure calluses, bruises, even bones that ache from years of bending and lifting, but the ache of being unseen, unvalued, mocked in the presence of those you love, that kind of pain lingers in places no medicine can reach. Every time they dismissed me, something inside me bent a little more. I watched them trade stories about their cleverness, their money, their future plans, and I sat there, silent, knowing I had given them the ground they stood on, knowing I had poured myself into their comfort, yet being treated as though I was nothing but an accessory to their lives. They would laugh at the way I held my tools, at the dirt under my fingernails, at the shirts I wore until they frayed at the sleeves. To them, those things were proof of smallness. To me, they were proof of endurance. But no one wanted to see that. It is a terrible thing to be reduced to a function. To be measured not by the love you carried, not by the battles you had fought in silence, not by the wisdom earned through struggle, but by how quickly you could repair a hinge or unclog a drain. They believed they knew my worth, and so they mocked it freely. They didn't know that behind each repair, behind every steady hand and every careful fix, was a story they had never cared to ask about. And that was the hardest truth of all. It wasn't strangers who hurt me the most. It was the ones who bore my name, the ones who had grown under my roof, the ones who should have known me better than anyone else. Mockery from outsiders could be ignored, but mockery from your own blood? That's a wound that seeps slowly, day by day, until you are left wondering whether you were ever more than the hammer they saw in your hands. Each night, when the houses around me filled with voices and laughter, I walked back to mine in silence. The streets seemed to echo my footsteps, louder than they should have, as if reminding me that the only sound I carried home was the rattle of metal and wood inside my worn tool bag. That bag had become my shadow, every screw, every wrench, every hammer striking against each other with a weight heavier than steel. They sang louder than gratitude ever had, louder than any words my family refused to say. I would place the bag down gently, as though setting aside a fragile part of myself. My hands still trembled with the residue of the day, hands that had steadied ladders, tightened bolts, carried burdens no one saw. And then came the silence. A silence so thick it pressed against my chest. No, thank you. No, we couldn't have done this without you. Not even the smallest glance that said I mattered. Only the quiet, the kind that eats away at a man until even his heartbeat feels unnecessary. I'd sit at the kitchen table sometimes, staring at the scars across my knuckles. Each mark was a memory. A roof repaired in a storm, a furnace fixed in the freezing dark, a child's toy mended late at night so it would not be broken by morning. These were not just repairs. They were pieces of myself, given away freely, quietly, without keeping score. Yet those same scars, to my family, were evidence of nothing. They didn't see sacrifice in them. They saw a man who had never aimed higher, someone who only knew how to work with his hands. What they never understood was that silence has a sound. It's the sound of footsteps dragging after a day of labor, the sound of tools clinking together in the dark, the sound of a man replaying words of mockery long after the voices that spoke them have gone to bed. Silence isn't empty. It's filled with everything you wish had been said, but never was. And in my home, silence had become my only companion. Sometimes I would catch myself wondering if this was what I was born for. To be the one who repaired what others broke, but never to be remembered once it worked again. People praise architects, designers, dreamers, the ones who imagine, but they never praise the one who keeps the dream standing when the weight threatens to bring it down. My life was invisible maintenance, the kind no one noticed until it was gone, and I was starting to fear that when I was gone, nothing about me would remain, except maybe a drawer of old nails and a hammer left behind. The burden grew heavier each night, though nothing visible had changed. It was a silent burden, the kind that doesn't break bones, but bends the soul. And as I lay down in the dark, I could hear it pressing in, reminding me that tomorrow would be the same. Another day, another repair, another silence waiting at home. It happened on a night that should have been warm, filled with the comfort of family, a night when laughter and clinking glasses were meant to bind us closer. The table was heavy with food, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and sweet bread. Yet beneath it all lingered something colder, something I had grown used to but never fully prepared for, the knowledge that, in this house, my presence was tolerated, never honored. The betrayal came softly, almost casual, slipped into the flow of conversation like a knife between ribs. My son, my own flesh, my blood, the boy I had carried on my shoulders when he was too tired to walk, looked at me across the table and said, without hesitation, without shame, "Don't interrupt, we're talking about real matters now." The words silenced the room, but not in defense of me. No one rose to challenge him. No voice came to my aid. They nodded, they continued to talk, as though nothing had been torn apart in that moment. My fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate, and I lowered my eyes. It wasn't just the sting of his dismissal. It was the weight of knowing the very ground beneath them had been built by these hands they so easily ignored. That roof that sheltered them from storms, those walls that echoed with their laughter, that table where they feasted, all of it had been shaped, measured, hammered, and secured by me. And yet, in their eyes, I was nothing more than a guest who had overstayed his welcome. I tried to steady myself, to remind my heart not to break. Betrayal doesn't always come in grand acts. Sometimes it comes in small words spoken at the wrong moment. But those words linger. They settle in your bones, where no apology can reach. That night, I understood something with painful clarity. I was no longer the father, the man who had sacrificed so they could rise higher. I was an intruder in the life I had built for them, an uninvited hand at the table. The sound of their voices, carrying on without me, felt sharper than any tool I'd ever gripped. They laughed. They argued about business, about investments, about what they called real matters. And I sat there in silence, the outsider in a home that bore my sweat in its foundation. A man can survive many things: hunger, hard labor, even loneliness. But to be erased by your own children while sitting in the very chair you carved for them is a wound that does not heal. I left that night without a word, my footsteps heavy against the floorboards I had once polished. Every creak of the wood seemed to echo the truth. I had built this house, but it no longer belonged to me. My place had been stolen, not by strangers, but by the very ones I had given everything to. And betrayal, when it comes from your own blood, is heavier than any stone a man can carry. It was late afternoon when I felt it, the kind of moment that makes the air itself pause. I was walking home, my tool bag dragging at my side, its weight heavier than usual, though inside it carried the same things it always had: wrenches, nails, a hammer, dulled by years of use. My steps were slow, my back bent slightly from the long day. People passed without seeing me, the way they always did, eyes fixed on their own hurried lives. But then, there he was, a young man, tall, his shoulders tense as though he carried something invisible yet unbearable. He stopped in his tracks the moment he saw me. His eyes searched mine with an urgency I didn't understand. It was not the look of a stranger asking for directions, nor of someone seeing just another passerby. It was deeper, like recognition pressed against the glass of memory, desperate to break through. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world narrowed to that gaze. His lips parted, as though words were fighting to rise, but none came. There was a tremor in his silence, the kind that hides a storm beneath the surface. And then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. He lowered his eyes, clenched his jaw, and walked away without a sound, disappearing into the crowd. I stood frozen, my hand tightening on the strap of my bag. My heart beat faster, though I could not explain why. Something in his eyes had unsettled me, something raw, almost pleading, as if he carried a truth he wasn't ready to speak. It felt familiar, though I couldn't place it. That expression, the look of a soul teetering between collapse and survival. I had seen it before, long ago. The silence of that brief encounter followed me all the way home. It echoed louder than my tools clanging together with each step. I sat that evening in my small kitchen, staring at the door as though expecting him to appear again, to finish whatever had been left unsaid. But the night remained empty, filled only with the familiar weight of solitude. And yet, I couldn't shake the thought. Why did he look at me like that? Why did his eyes seem to say, "You matter, though you've forgotten it yourself"? It had been so long since anyone had looked at me with anything other than dismissal or ridicule. The gaze of that young man lingered long after he was gone, a whisper I could not silence. I didn't know it yet, but that moment was the crack in the silence of my life, a crack through which something would soon break, something that had been buried under years of mockery and betrayal. The stranger's eyes had spoken a truth louder than any words I had heard at my family's table. I was not invisible. Not entirely. That night, long after the streets had emptied and the lights in the houses around me had dimmed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The stranger's eyes would not leave me. They returned again and again, carrying something I could not name but could not ignore. And then, slowly, like a door creaking open after years of being locked, a memory stirred, faint at first, then sharper, clearer, until I was no longer in my bed, but back in a different time, a different place, standing beside a boy with hollow eyes and scraped hands. He had been no more than 15, maybe 16. A thin figure on a broken bicycle, its chain snapped, the tires worn down, the frame bent as though life itself had decided it was too much trouble to keep him moving. I remembered the way he had sat on the curb, staring at the ground as if the concrete held more promise than his future. His clothes were torn, his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke. He didn't ask for help. He didn't believe he deserved it. But I stopped anyway. Something in his silence had called out to me. I knelt down, pulled out a few tools from the bag I carried even then, and began to mend the bike. My hands worked quickly, steady, but my eyes stayed on him. He wouldn't meet my gaze. And so, as I fixed the chain, as I tightened the bolts, I said the only words I knew might matter. Don't give up, even when your life feels broken. Broken things can be mended. You can be mended too. At the time, I thought little of it. I had always believed in repairing what could be saved: wood, metal, stone, and, when I could, people. I left him with a working bicycle and a pat on the shoulder. He left me with nothing but the hope that he might believe those words one day. And then the years passed, and the memory faded, tucked away under the weight of countless other repairs, countless other silences. But now, lying in the dark, the memory burned as if it had never left. The stranger's eyes on the street, the way they trembled, the way they reached toward me without speaking, suddenly aligned with the boy I had once helped. Could it be him? Could the young man who looked at me with such unspoken recognition be the same lost boy I had met years ago with grease on his hands and despair in his heart? The thought unsettled me, but it also stirred something deeper. For the first time in years, I felt the past tugging at the edges of my present, reminding me that my life had not always been silence and dismissal. Once my words had mattered. Once my presence had been enough to lift someone from the edge. And perhaps, just perhaps, the stranger's gaze was proof that the small things we do, the things no one else sees, have roots that grow in places we may never witness. As I closed my eyes, the sound of a bicycle chain clicking into place echoed louder than the mocking laughter of my family. And in that moment, I realized maybe I had not been invisible all along. The memory of that boy's face, the broken bicycle, the words I had once spoken, they stayed with me like a fragile ember, faint but alive. I wanted, for the first time in years, to share it, to let my family know that I was not just the man with the hammer and the toolbox, that there were chapters of my life they had never opened, truths they had never cared to ask about. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that if they heard me, they might see me differently. So, One evening, while we sat around the table, I tried. My voice was quiet at first, uncertain, but I began to tell them. I spoke of the boy on the broken bike, how I had stopped, how I had given him not just a repair, but a reason to believe he could keep moving forward. I didn't embellish. I didn't demand admiration. I just told them the truth, because I wanted them to know that even if I looked small in their eyes, my life had reached farther than they imagined. But the silence that followed was not the silence of awe. It was the silence of dismissal. My daughter broke it with a laugh, sharp and careless. "You're exaggerating," she said, waving her hand as if brushing away dust. "You make it sound like you saved someone's life just because you fixed a chain." The others chuckled, their voices overlapping, filling the room with a noise louder than my story, louder than my truth. Their laughter grew, a tide rising over me, drowning out everything I had tried to say. And in that moment, I understood what cold really meant. It wasn't the chill of winter pressing against the windows. It was the frost that settles over you when your own blood mocks your heart. It was the ice that spreads when you realize your words will never find soil here, only stone. I looked at their faces, faces I had loved, faces I had provided for, faces I had believed would always carry some trace of gratitude, and all I saw was indifference. I sat back in my chair, the ember inside me dimming under their laughter. My hands, those same hands that had once steadied a boy on the edge of despair, now trembled, not from age, not from labor, but from the weight of being unheard. The cold silence of that night was worse than loneliness. Loneliness is the absence of voices. This was the presence of voices, sharp and cruel, turning truth into a joke. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply let their laughter carry on, because I had learned long ago that some walls are too thick to break with words. Yet as I stared into my glass, watching the reflection of my face ripple and distort, a thought pressed hard against me. If even the truth cannot thaw their silence, then maybe justice must come from somewhere else, somewhere outside the circle of this table. And still, beneath the noise, I felt the stranger's gaze echoing in me, like a quiet reminder that the world might not be as blind as the ones who shared my blood. There comes a point when silence is no longer a shield, but a prison. I had worn it for so long, carried it on my shoulders like a second skin, that I almost believed it was the only way to survive. I told myself it was enough to fix their homes, to keep their lives in order while mine remained unseen. I convinced myself that dignity could be found in labor, that worth didn't need applause. But night after night, sitting alone with nothing but the clatter of my tools, I began to wonder if I had mistaken endurance for surrender. I watched my children climb their ladders of success, their names printed in newspapers, their photographs framed in offices, their voices admired in rooms filled with strangers. I was proud, yes, but pride has a way of souring when you realize they built those ladders on your back, and now they no longer even remember who held them steady. To them, I was not father, not guide, not the foundation beneath their steps. I was just the man who knew how to fix a hinge, patch a roof, unclog a drain. A man measured in minutes, in hours of service, a handyman for hire, even in his own home. I told myself I could live with it, that I didn't need their recognition, that work was enough, that usefulness was its own form of love. But inside me, something began to fracture, because usefulness without respect is nothing but quiet slavery, and the worst chains are the ones you pretend you don't feel, until one day they pull tight enough to choke. It was the smallest things that pushed me closer to the breaking point. A conversation cut short when I entered the room, a dismissive glance when I tried to speak, a joke whispered just loud enough for me to hear. They thought I didn't notice, or worse, They thought I was too dull to care. But I heard every word, felt every wound, and while I kept my eyes lowered, inside I was burning. I almost let go of the hope that anything would ever change. I almost convinced myself that this was how my story would end. The invisible man, the one who fixed what others broke, and then faded quietly, remembered only for his calloused hands. I almost surrendered to the shadows of their success, content to remain the background to their shining lives. Almost. But something in me refused. Something stubborn, buried deep, that whispered, "You are more than this. You were always more than this." The memory of the boy with the broken bicycle still clung to me, a reminder that even small acts ripple further than you can see. Perhaps my family had chosen blindness, but the world beyond them had not forgotten. And the stranger's eyes on that street, they had stirred something I thought long dead. The breaking point is not a single moment. It is the accumulation of years, of silences swallowed, of truths ignored, of dignity denied. And I could feel it drawing near, like a storm pressing at the edges of my chest, waiting for the moment when it would no longer be contained. I had spent a lifetime fixing what was broken in others, but now, for the first time, I realized something else needed repair. Myself. I saw him again, on a day that felt ordinary enough to erase itself. Gray sky, buses coughing at the curb, a line outside the bakery, my tool bag leaving a damp stripe against my trousers where the handle pressed and rubbed. I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined the first encounter, that I'd turned a stranger's glance into meaning because I needed some. Then he stepped out of the crowd and into my path with the certainty of a man who had finally found what he'd been searching for. The suit was precise, the shoes polished, the posture held together by a spine that had weathered something harder than work. His face had changed with the years, filled out, sharpened, burnished by rooms I'd never be invited into. But the eyes were the same. Old fear turned into steadiness, a storm that had learned how to carry itself without breaking. For a heartbeat, we just stood there, a standoff in the middle of the sidewalk while the city poured around us. A cyclist swerved, a horn called out, someone cursed from a car window. Everything moved except the two of us. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't startle me with loud gratitude or careless familiarity. He only looked, and in that look I felt the unsettling click of a memory sliding into place. Grease under fingernails, a chain rethreaded in the dusk, a boy unable to say help out loud. He drew closer, by inches, as if afraid that sudden movement might scatter whatever invisible thread connected us. I noticed the details because work teaches you to read surfaces. Pale crescent of an old scar near the wrist bone, a watch with scuffs hidden just beneath the shine, a small tear near the seam of his jacket, where a thread had been tugged and smoothed back. Success leaves polish, life leaves marks. He carried both. The air between us tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and some part of me braced for dismissal. The practiced smile of a man mistaking me for someone else. I had been mistaken for less my entire life. But he held steady. My bag slipped a fraction on my shoulder. I didn't move to fix it. It felt right to let its weight be seen. Something uncoiled in his face, relief mixed with the ache of having waited too long. People brushed past, annoyed at the interruption of their straight lines, but he still refused to step aside. There was apology in the set of his jaw for the first time we'd passed like ghosts, and determination now, the kind that forces a door without breaking it. The city has a way of swallowing moments like this, grinding them down into the gravel of daily life, until no one remembers they were sharp ones. But not this one. This one held. I watched him fight for the first word the way a drowning man fights for the surface. Not desperate, but deliberate, stroke by disciplined stroke. A man who had taught his lungs to wait. I didn't give him anything to ease it. Not out of pride, not out of cruelty, but because something told me the words had to come from his side first. The only way to honor whatever crossing he had made between the boy on the curb and the man in the suit. My silence wasn't the old prison. It was space. A clearing made with both hands in a forest choked by years. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, as if he understood that I understood. Wind tugged at his tie. He didn't fix it. He kept his eyes on me the way a person keeps his eyes on a door he's terrified will shut again. The expression I had seen flicker weeks ago was here in full. Not pity, not charity, not even gratitude yet, but recognition. The kind that doesn't flatter either side because it costs too much to counterfeit. In that inch of sidewalk, I felt the past stir with the heavy grace of a machine reawakening after years of disuse. The chain, the words, the way he had steadied the handlebars while I steadied the world beneath him. None of it had seemed large enough to merit memory, and yet here it was, threading itself through traffic and weather and time, refusing to loosen. He exhaled, and the sound carried the wear of nights that do not end at dawn. Around us, a bus door sighed open. Passengers climbed. A mother scolded a child. A delivery man rattled a metal cart across cracked concrete. Life shouted. This moment whispered. And still, I heard nothing else. He lifted a hand finally, not to touch, but to anchor the moment in the air between us. The gesture was careful, almost ceremonial, the way you would reach towards something you've spent years afraid of breaking. When his voice came, it was low, measured, worn smooth by all the rough places it had traveled to get here. He asked for a second of my time. That was all. Not a performance, not a scene, just a fraction, a sliver, a respectful request to hold the world still long enough to repay a debt that had outgrown currency. I could have walked around him. I had done it my whole life, stepping aside, making space, allowing others to pass through the doors I had hung straight. But there are seconds that ask you who you are, and the way you answer becomes permanent. I let the tool bag slide down and come to rest against my leg. The strap left a red line across my shoulder that pulsed and faded. I straightened without thinking about it. My back remembered how. His eyes softened at that small permission. It was all he'd needed. The words themselves would come next. I could feel them gathering, heavy with years, bright with something I didn't dare name yet. But for now the street belonged to neither of us, and somehow to both, a narrow bridge built in the space of a breath. He took that breath. I took mine. And the city, indifferent and roaring and eternal, made just enough room for what had been waiting to be said. His lips finally parted, and the words slipped out with the weight of years pressing behind them. You don't remember me, do you? His voice was steady at first, but in the space between syllables there was a tremor, the kind that doesn't come from weakness, but from holding something too long inside. He didn't wait for my answer. His chest rose and fell once, sharp, and then the truth broke free. You saved my life. If not for your words, I would never have climbed out of that darkness. The noise of the city kept rushing around us, but in that moment it fell away. Car horns blared, conversations buzzed. A street vendor shouted over a cart of roasted nuts, but all of it blurred into nothing. His words struck harder than any insult I had endured at my own table, harder than all the laughter that had weighed me down like stones. My silence, my obscurity, the decades of being just the handyman, they shattered in that instant. I stared at him, and for the first time in years I felt the world tilt, reminding me of something I had nearly forgotten, that what we do in small, hidden moments can echo far beyond our knowing. I had not thought about him since that day, when his bicycle sat broken and his spirit nearly worse. To me, it had been a passing kindness, one more quiet repair in a life filled with them. To him, it had been a lifeline. My hands had fixed more than a chain. They had steadied a boy at the edge of despair, and he had carried those words, the ones I spoke almost absent-mindedly, simply because they felt true, through years of storms I could not imagine. He stood before me now, not as a lost boy, but as a man whose life bore the marks of struggle survived. The suit on his shoulders, the steady fire in his eyes, the resolve in his voice, all of it testified not to an easy path, but to one chosen against the pull of darkness. And he laid the credit at my feet, not out of flattery, but out of the raw necessity of truth. He needed me to know. He needed to give back what had been planted in him long ago, in the form of a seed I had almost forgotten I had sown. For years, my family's voices had been louder than my own story. They had mocked, diminished, erased. They had called me small. Yet here, in the middle of the street, a man with everything to lose stopped the world to say otherwise. His gratitude was not loud, but it carried a gravity that no laughter could drown. It filled the silence I had carried for so long with something new, something dangerous to despair. I felt my throat tighten, though no words came. My hands, calloused and scarred, shook as if they understood before my heart did. I had lived a life of being unseen, but now I was seen, not as a set of tools, not as a servant in my own house, but as a man who had once saved another without even knowing it. And in that revelation, a strange justice stirred. It did not roar. It did not demand. It simply stood there, embodied in the man before me, reminding me that the truth cannot be silenced forever. Some words, once spoken, do not die. They wait. They grow. They return, even when the world tries to bury them. And now, standing before me with trembling voice and steady eyes, the boy I had once lifted was lifting me. The words had barely left his lips when the air itself seemed to change. People walking by slowed, then stopped altogether, as though the world had stumbled into a pause. A mother tugging her child's hand halted mid-step. A man with a briefcase lowered his phone from his ear. Even the bus driver waiting at the corner leaned forward, his eyes drawn to the scene unfolding on the sidewalk. The city that had been roaring only a heartbeat ago grew quiet, pulled into the gravity of a truth too heavy to ignore. And then I felt them. My son and daughter, who had been just a few steps ahead, turned at the sound of the man's trembling voice. Their faces, so often set in that familiar mask of dismissal, faltered. In my son's eyes there was something I had not seen in years. Doubt. Not the arrogant kind he used to wield at me like a weapon, but a shadow creeping across certainty, softening the edges of the world he thought he knew. My daughter's lips parted slightly, as if the words she wanted to speak had been stolen away. For the first time, they looked at me not as the handyman who trailed behind their lives, but as a stranger they did not fully recognize. The crowd around us stood frozen, waiting. They had no idea of the years of silence, the years of being mocked, the dinners where I was invisible. They only knew what they had just heard, that a man in a suit with a voice that shook but did not break had declared that I had once saved him, that I had pulled him from darkness, with nothing more than a repair and a few words. To them it was a revelation. To my children, it was an earthquake. I did not look away from the man before me, but I felt their stares burning into me, searching for answers I was not ready to give. Their world had been built on the belief that I was small, useful only in simple tasks. But in an instant, that belief cracked. Someone outside the bloodline, someone with no reason to lie, had spoken a truth they could not dismiss with a laugh. The silence around us was no longer cold. It was charged, alive, carrying the weight of unspoken questions. I could see it in their faces, the recognition that maybe they had been wrong. Maybe the father they had ridiculed, the man they had silenced at their table, had lived a life that stretched far beyond their narrow judgment. And in that flicker of doubt, I saw something I had almost given up on, an opening. The stranger's voice had done what my own could never accomplish. It pierced the wall of indifference, shattered the comfort of their scorn, and forced them to confront the possibility that they did not know me at all. And for the first time in many years, it was not me who felt small. It was them. I did not gloat. I did not speak. I simply stood there, my tool bag resting heavy at my feet, my hands trembling with a mixture of pain and vindication. The silence that had once buried me now rose to defend me, and in that silence my children stood frozen, forced to face the truth. Their father was not just the handyman. He was something more, something they had refused to see until the world itself stopped to show them. His voice did not falter when he spoke again. It rose, not in anger, not in performance, but in the kind of strength that only comes when a man tells the truth he has carried too long in silence. "I built a company," he said, each word clear enough to cut through the traffic, the chatter, even through the pulse of the city itself. "I speak to students now. I tell them the words you told me. I am alive because you gave me a reason not to give up." And suddenly, it wasn't just him talking to me. It was as if he was talking to everyone around us. The crowd, my children, the strangers pausing on the sidewalk, they all leaned into his confession, drawn by the power of a life that had been reshaped by a single moment of kindness, by a sentence spoken when no one else cared to notice. His voice filled the air, and it was louder than all the ridicule I had endured, louder than all the laughter that had chased me from my own table. I saw it in the way people's faces shifted. They didn't just hear his words, they felt them. The recognition of how fragile a soul can be, how a life can hang by a thread, how one sentence spoken in the right moment can pull someone back from the edge. The man standing there in his polished shoes and tailored suit was not just a success story. He was a survivor, and he made it clear that survival had been handed to him by hands the world had mocked, by words spoken from the lips of a man dismissed as just handy. My son's face hardened at first, pride fighting against what he heard. But even he could not hide the way his eyes wavered. My daughter blinked fast, her jaw tightening as if trying to resist the truth breaking through her defenses. They had seen me as small, replaceable, a background figure. But here was proof standing in front of them, undeniable, wearing the weight of gratitude like armor, declaring that their father had changed a life more deeply than any diploma or deal could. And as he spoke, I felt something inside me shift. For years, I had carried silence like a curse. I had let their dismissal define me, had let their laughter bury my worth. But this man's testimony lifted that weight, piece by piece, until I could breathe again. I had believed I was invisible. I had believed my life had slipped into obscurity, useful only in broken hinges and leaky faucets. Yet here was a man telling me, telling everyone, that my life had already carved something lasting, something that outlived the silence. The street was no longer just a street, it became a courtroom, and his testimony was evidence that could not be denied. And in that courtroom, I was no longer the accused, no longer the forgotten. I was the man whose quiet words had built more than walls or tables. I had built hope. And as his voice carried into the stillness, I realized justice had begun to arrive. Not in thunder, not in vengeance, but in the living proof of a life I had once touched, and a life that now touched mine in return. The moment his words rang out, something in the air broke open. It was no longer a quiet conversation between two men in the middle of a street. It had become a declaration that everyone around us was forced to witness. Strangers who moments before had been rushing to catch buses, to answer phones, to carry groceries, now stood still, their lives paused by the weight of what they had just heard. The silence that followed was not the silence of ignorance anymore. It was the silence of awe. For years, my life had been buried beneath ridicule. Every hammer strike, every tightened bolt, every small kindness had been dismissed as nothing more than what he does. My family, my children, they thought my worth ended where my toolbox began. But here, before their eyes and the eyes of the city itself, the truth rose to the surface. It wasn't me who spoke it. It wasn't me who demanded it. It was carried by the voice of another, a man who owed me nothing but gave me everything in return. His testimony. The crowd felt it. I could see it in their stillness, in the way some held their breath without realizing. They understood that they weren't just hearing about a bicycle or a boy in despair. They were hearing the truth about how fragile a life can be, how one small act, one repair of a broken chain, could ripple outward into decades, into success, into survival itself. My hands, the same hands that had been mocked for being dirty, rough, ordinary, had once held more than tools. They had held another man's future, and now the world knew it. I glanced at my son and daughter. Their faces told the story better than words could. Shock first, then disbelief, then something else, something heavier, harder to hide. Shame. My son's eyes dropped, unable to meet mine, while my daughter bit her lip as though trying to swallow her own laughter from nights before. Laughter that now sounded hollow even in memory. They had called me small, but the truth stood taller than all their mockery. The man in the suit, the stranger whose gaze had unsettled me weeks before, had torn down the walls they built around me with nothing more than his honesty. Justice had come, and it had come in the open. No family dinner could bury it. No mocking smile could smother it. Everyone had heard. Everyone had seen. And once the truth has been spoken aloud, it cannot be unsaid. The city itself seemed to carry his words on its breath, spreading them further than I ever could. For so long I had believed my life was invisible, that the work of my hands would disappear the moment I was gone. But now, standing on that street with the weight of his testimony ringing in my ears, I understood something different. I had already left a mark, not carved in stone or written in books, but living in the very soul of another human being. And no ridicule, no betrayal, no silence could erase that. They tried at first to stand firm, to keep their expressions neutral, but truth has a way of stripping away every mask. My son shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his jaw clenched tight as if he could grind the shame into dust behind his teeth. My daughter looked down, her shoulders tense, her eyes fixed on the ground as though it might open and swallow her whole. The pride that had always sat so easily on their faces was gone, replaced by something rawer, something heavier. Silence. It was not the comfortable silence of people at ease. It was the kind of silence that presses on the chest, that makes the air feel thick, that leaves words trapped in the throat because no word can undo what has already been revealed. Their laughter, the same laughter that had followed me for years like a shadow, had died suddenly, without ceremony. What remained was awkwardness, a desperate stillness where their mockery used to live. They had spent a lifetime calling me just handy, dismissing me as though my life were measured in broken hinges and dripping taps. But now, under the weight of the man's testimony, the phrase sounded foolish, cruel, too small to contain the truth. And it wasn't just them who felt it. The crowd still lingered, watching, silent witnesses to a reckoning that had been a long time coming. Strangers' eyes flicked between me and my children, and in those looks was judgment, quiet but undeniable. My family had mocked me in private, but now their scorn had been exposed under the open sky, and it collapsed beneath the light. There was no defense left. No dismissive shrug, no roll of the eyes, no bitter laugh could stand against the truth spoken by a man whose life bore my fingerprints. I did not gloat. I did not speak. I simply stood there, my tool bag heavy at my side, my hands resting on its worn strap. The same hands they had once ridiculed, the same bag they had called the mark of my smallness, now stood as proof of everything they had refused to see. Every scar, every callus, every nail pounded into wood had carried more meaning than they had ever allowed themselves to admit. And now they knew it. My daughter's lips trembled as though she wanted to say something, but the words never came. My son finally raised his head, his eyes flicking toward me for a second before falling again, unable to hold the weight of mine. They had silenced me for years. Now it was their turn to choke on silence. For the first time in decades, I did not feel small in their presence. I did not feel like a shadow in their success. They stood before me stripped of certainty, exposed by the voice of a stranger who carried my legacy in his chest. They could no longer call me just the handyman. That name had died in the same moment their laughter did, and in its place something larger, undeniable, had taken root. I did not speak. There were no words left to give. My whole life had been a series of swallowed sentences, of silences carried like burdens, of truths buried under laughter that wasn't joy but scorn. And yet, in this final moment, silence no longer felt like defeat. It felt like victory. I simply turned, lifted the strap of my bag once more onto my shoulder, and walked away. The weight was the same, but the meaning had changed. For the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying tools. I was carrying proof. The crowd parted as I moved, not with indifference, not with the dismissive glances I had grown used to, but with quiet reverence. They had heard, they had seen, and they would not forget. My children remained behind, still frozen, their eyes lowered, their voices trapped. Perhaps in their silence they finally understood what I had carried all these years. Perhaps the shame they felt was the first crack in the armor of their pride. But I did not wait for apologies. I did not wait for recognition. I had already received something greater. The man, the boy I once helped, the stranger whose eyes had found me in the street, reached for my hand as I began to leave. His grip was firm, trembling not from weakness, but from gratitude too great to contain. "You changed my life," he said again, his voice steady now, louder than it had been before, carrying over the heads of strangers and family alike. "You changed my life." He repeated it as though the words themselves were a bridge he was building back to me, plank by plank, until the years of silence no longer stretched between us. And in that simple act, justice revealed itself. Not in thunder, not in grand declarations, not in punishment or vengeance, but in recognition. The truth had finally been spoken aloud. The life I thought had been spent in shadows, in quiet repairs and unseen sacrifices, stood revealed as something else entirely, a legacy. A legacy not carved in stone or written in books, but etched into human lives, carried forward by those who once stood on the edge of despair and found hope because of me. As I walked down that street, the city itself seemed changed. Each face I passed carried the echo of what they had witnessed. Some nodded, some lowered their eyes in respect, some simply stepped aside. The sound of my footsteps was no longer lonely. It was accompanied by the memory of his voice, the memory of his grip, the weight of words that would not be forgotten. The world had heard the truth, and it would linger, longer than any insult, longer than any mockery. Behind me, my family stood in silence. Before me stretched a road that no longer felt empty. The years of dismissal, of being just handy, could not erase what had been revealed. My legacy was not the walls I had built, or the roofs I had patched. My legacy was this: a life lived in quiet labor that had given strength to another, a dignity that mockery could not destroy, a truth that outlasted betrayal. Justice did not arrive with a roar. It arrived as a whisper that grew louder than every laugh, as a gaze that remembered what others had chosen to forget, as a hand clasping mine with the weight of gratitude. And in that moment, I understood. It was enough. My life, humble and hidden, had mattered. It had left a mark, and that mark would stay. I walked on, silent, steady. The bag against my side no longer clattered with tools alone. It carried something greater, proof that a man's worth is never measured by the titles others deny him, but by the lives that bear his imprint long after he is gone. The street remembered, he remembered, and at last I remembered too.